14 bodies. Not in a decade, not in a war. In 8 months. The strangest part isn't how they died, because in Newark, people died all the time back then. The strangest part is what happened after. A thin folder, one label, and 2 words. No action. So who were the Carbones? A mafia crew? A shadow unit? Or just a family in the food business that got pushed one step too far and decided the only way to survive was to become the thing everyone feared?
14 bodies. Not in a decade, not in a war. In 8 months. And the strangest part isn't how they died, because in Newark, people died all the time back then. The strangest part is what happened after. Because when a federal prosecutor finally reopened the box, years later, he found one thin folder with a label written in his own handwriting. Carbone. Newark. 1977-1978. No action. Let that sink. 14 dead mob-connected men, and someone in Washington allegedly decided it wasn't worth touching. So who were the Carbones? A mafia crew? A shadow unit? A government asset? Or just a family in the food business that got pushed one step too far and decided the only way to survive was to become the thing everyone feared? Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the full story of what's been called the Newark bloodbath, the broken deal, the torture that triggered it, the systematic retaliation, and the chilling reason the government may have let it happen. Because if even half of this is true, then the most terrifying killers in Newark weren't mobsters. They were the people who looked the most normal. March 2023, Princeton, New Jersey. A retired federal prosecutor, Raymond Castelletti, now in his late 70s, sits down to write his memoirs. Decades of his life were spent in the world of organized crime, wiretaps, informants, RICO cases, capos, underbosses, the whole ecosystem. The kind of career where you measure time in indictments, not birthdays. But there's one thing that bothers him. One case he can't remember closing. A file he can't remember choosing to walk away from. He goes into storage, old boxes, old notes, old transcripts, and he finds it. A folder that's almost insulting in how small it is. Barely a dozen pages. Crime scene photos, a sealed witness statement, a memo from a supervisor, and across the front, those words, no action. Inside the folder, images of 14 bodies found over an 8-month period between 1977 and 1978, all connected at least loosely to organized crime in North Jersey. But the killings weren't sloppy. They weren't loud. They weren't theatrical. They were described as clean, professional, methodical, like someone wasn't sending a message, like someone was erasing a list. Then Raymond reads the sealed statement from a confidential informant. It describes a family operating a food distribution business in Newark's Ironbound district, a family with a name that sounds almost ordinary, Carbone, and then the memo that changes everything. Dated late 1978, from Raymond's superior. It says, in effect, per discussion with Washington, the Carbone matter is closed. No prosecutorial interest. Archive without action. Washington. Meaning, someone above everyone in that building made a decision. And the prosecutor, who spent his life believing the law always had the last word, realizes something ugly. Sometimes the system doesn't fail. Sometimes the system chooses. And that's when he decides to do the one thing he never did back then. He reopens the file. The story goes the Carbone family had been in the food business since the early 1900s. A classic immigrant trajectory. A pushcart, a storefront, a warehouse, trucks, employees, a reputation. By the late 1970s, they weren't rich like Wall Street, but they were stable, they were growing, they were proud. And in the Ironbound, being a legitimate business didn't just mean hard work. It meant something else. It meant you were visible, and visibility attracts predators. Newark in the 1970s, after the riots and economic collapse, is often described like a city hollowed out. Businesses fled, tax base shrank, crime surged, and when official systems weaken, unofficial systems move in. Organized crime thrives in places where people feel unprotected, and according to this account, the dominant force pressing on local businesses was connected to the DeCavalcante crime family, the North Jersey Mafia ecosystem. Here's how it worked, allegedly. You want your trucks left alone? You pay. You want your warehouse not to accidentally burn down? You pay. You want your drivers to come home in one piece? You pay. It's called protection, but it's only protection from the people selling it. And like most businesses trying to survive, the Carbones paid, not because they respected it, not because they liked it, because they had families to feed and employees depending on them. But then a man rose inside that world, a man described as greedy, ambitious, and reckless. His name, in this account, is Nicky Toretta, and he didn't just want tribute, he wanted a piece of the business itself. Early 1977, two men arrive at the Carbone warehouse. They call it a conversation between businessmen, but everyone understands what it is. A demand. The message is simple. The arrangement is changing. No longer monthly payments. Now the crew wants an ownership stake, a percentage, a permanent cut. And it's not a negotiation where you can say no. It's a negotiation where no is a countdown. The Carbone sons meet with their father, Enzo Carbone, the family patriarch in this story. And Enzo understands something immediately. If you give them 40% today, they'll want 60% tomorrow. If you surrender once, you teach them that surrender is your language. So he stalls. He buys time. He negotiates like a shopkeeper might negotiate over fruit prices, but behind the scenes, he's doing something else. He's learning names. He's learning patterns. He's learning habits. Not because he wants violence, because he wants options. Because in places like Newark, peace is often rented month to month, and the rent can spike overnight. And then the story turns. May 1977. One of Enzo's sons, Tony Carbone, leaves work like any other day, and he doesn't make it home. Days later, he is returned, alive, but broken. The account describes injuries that weren't accidental, not random, not impulsive, calculated. A message written on a human body. And the message was, stop stalling, stop negotiating, pay what we demanded, or next time, you won't get him back alive. Now, this is the moment everything changes. Because lots of people can tolerate pressure. Lots of people can tolerate humiliation. But there are two things that rewire a human mind. Watching someone you love suffer. And two, realizing it's going to happen again. Enzo sits in that hospital room and makes a decision. Not a business decision. A survival decision. The story goes he tells himself something like, I will not teach my grandchildren that submission is the price of staying alive. And from there, the Carbone story becomes something else entirely. Not protection, not tribute. A war. Quiet. Unacknowledged. Systematic. According to the narrative, Enzo doesn't lash out randomly. He plans. He treats it like an operation. Targets are identified. Routines are mapped. Vulnerabilities are noted. And then it starts. One man is found dead, then another, then two more. And what's strange is how the deaths are interpreted. Because when mob-connected men die in Newark, the default assumption is simple. Mob business. Internal beef. Power play. So investigations, if they happen at all, are thin. And as bodies pile up, Toretta's crew starts to fracture. Paranoia spreads. Men stop traveling alone. They change routes. They look over their shoulders. But the killings keep coming, and no one claims credit. No one steps forward to brag. No one sends a message, which is what terrifies them most. Because if no one is claiming it, it means the killer doesn't want respect. They want results. And if the story is true, Every time the Carbones eliminate someone, they learn more. Who reports to who, where money is kept, where the boss sleeps. It's not chaos, it's dismantling. And Toretta, who built his identity on intimidation, now learns what it feels like to be hunted. Not by a rival crew, by people he underestimated so completely that he never saw them as a threat. Until it was too late. This is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because it's no longer just about criminals. It's about institutions. The account claims that federal surveillance picked up chatter inside the organized crime world. People are dying and nobody knows who's doing it. And the chilling part, according to the narrative, is the alleged attitude behind the scenes. Dead mob soldiers weaken an organization. Weak organizations create informants. Chaos can be useful. So instead of stepping in, the approach is described as, watch, let it play out. Because, strategically, it helps. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that, if untrue, becomes myth instantly. But that's what makes the no-action memo so haunting inside the story. Because if 14 men die, and the official response is to archive it, then either the system was incompetent, or the system made a decision that looked a lot like consent. And that raises a question bigger than Newark. How many unsolved cases are unsolved because nobody could solve them? And how many are unsolved because someone decided it was better that way? The mob boss who finally says the name, the Carbones. As the narrative goes, by the time Toretta realizes what's happening, he's already lost too much. He goes up the chain. He tries to get help. He tries to explain. My men are being erased. And the response he gets is cold. You brought heat. You got greedy. You created this problem. Then, in a meeting described like a desperate confession, Toretta finally says the name out loud, the Carbones. And he tries to frame it like an impossible theory. They're businessmen, food distributors. So, maybe they hired someone. Maybe they're connected to something bigger. But the mob leadership, at least in this telling, doesn't laugh the way you'd expect. Because they understand something Toretta didn't. If you torture a man's son, a man from an old, tight community, you don't just create an enemy, you create a purpose. And purpose is more dangerous than money. Then comes the phone call. Toretta reaches out to Enzo. He wants to talk like businessmen. He offers money, compensation. He offers to back off, a return to the old arrangement. And Enzo agrees to meet him. A diner, a neutral place, witnesses. Now here's what makes this moment so tense. Because Toretta thinks he's setting a trap to confirm who's behind the hits. And Enzo thinks the opposite. This isn't a negotiation. This is confirmation that Toretta is desperate enough to walk into the open. And in this story's version of events, that diner meeting isn't about peace. It's about two men looking at the last step of a staircase. One of them wants to climb back up. The other wants to finish what he started. And Enzo's position, as told, is brutal in its simplicity. You can't buy back my son's hands. You can't erase what you did. So there's nothing to negotiate. Enzo leaves, and Toretta is left sitting there, finally understanding. This doesn't end with a deal. It ends with him. The end of Toretta, A.N.D. the 14th body. After that, the story enters its final stretch. Toretta tries to bring in outsiders. Professional help. Men with no ties to Newark. And in the account, even that fails. Because the ironbound, the docks, the restaurants, the delivery routes, that's where the Carbones live. It's where their normal life became their intelligence network. Eventually, Toretta is located, taken, and brought to a warehouse, the same kind of industrial space that Newark was full of back then. In the story, Enzo sits across from him, not screaming, not ranting, trying to understand, trying to force Toretta to explain the logic that lets a man torture another man's child over money. And Toretta's answer, if we accept the narrative, is as ugly as it is honest. I did it because I could, because nobody stopped me before. And that sentence, more than any gunshot, is the thesis of this entire story, because it explains why predators grow bold. They grow bold when the world teaches them there are no consequences. And in the Carbone account, consequences finally arrived. Not from police, not from the courts, from the people who were supposed to stay afraid. By the end, Toretta becomes what he made others feel: helpless, small, finished. And then, the 14th body eventually appears, months later, in a place where bodies were often found. And just like that, the killing stops. The silence in the neighborhood, here's the part that lingers. If you believe this account, the Carbones don't become gangsters afterward. They don't take territory. They don't start running rackets. They go back to delivering food. They keep the business alive. They raise families. And the neighborhood, quietly, breathes again. Because the pressure eases. The predators vanish. And nobody publicly thanks anyone. Because that's not how those communities survive. They survive by not speaking. By keeping secrets heavy enough to sink a whole block. And yet, the silence itself becomes a kind of monument. Because in this story, the ironbound learns a lesson that the mob forgot. You can terrorize a lot of people. But if you terrorize the wrong family, you might create something you can't control. The real horror, not the killings, but the no action. Let's go back to where we began. The retired prosecutor, the thin folder, the memo, closed, no prosecutorial interest. That phrase is the shadow hanging over everything. Because even if the story is exaggerated, even if names are wrong, even if details were dramatized, the theme is real enough to scare you. Sometimes the law doesn't arrive in time. Sometimes it doesn't arrive at all. And when people realize nobody is coming to save them, they don't all respond the same way. Some people run. Some people pay. Some people break. And a few, rare, terrifying few, decide to become their own enforcement arm. Not because they want to, because they think they have to. Now here's the question that makes this story radioactive. If authorities truly suspected the Carbones and still chose no action, was it because they couldn't prove it, or because, behind closed doors, someone decided the outcome was convenient? And if that's true, then what does justice even mean? Is justice the law, or is justice whatever result powerful people decide to tolerate? 14 dead men, one broken deal, one son tortured to send a message, and one family that allegedly answered with silence and method. If this story unsettled you, it should, because it isn't just about mobsters. It's about what happens when a system collapses, and ordinary people realize the line between civilian and killer is sometimes only one tragedy wide. So here's my question to you. If you were Enzo Carbone, and your son was returned to you broken, and you knew the next time would be worse, do you stay inside the law, or do you become the law? If you want more stories like this, stories where the official record says one thing, and the street whispers say another, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, which part of the Newark bloodbath do you believe, and which part feels like it was meant to stay buried? Because somewhere in Newark, there was a parking lot built over an old life. And most people walk across it every day with no idea what the ground beneath them remembers. And maybe that's the point. Some cities don't heal. They just pave over the evidence.